All right, so let's jump right into this deep dive with some of these excerpts you shared about Alberto Vilanova. I mean, he really tackles some fascinating stuff about how we understand the mind, right? Like from different cultural perspectives.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff. There's this, well, he highlights this divide, this kind of clash almost
Mm.
between Anglo-American and European perspectives on the mind.
Yeah, and he even uses that analogy of the Anglo-American model being like a conquering force, which is such a powerful image. What do you think he's getting at there?
It really is a powerful way to think about it, and I think he's pointing to this tendency to default to one particular way of thinking.
Mm.
He's suggesting that the Anglo-American model, which is really rooted in empiricism, that idea that knowledge comes from observation and experience, it relentlessly searches for this center in the mind.
Huh. So it's like we're always looking for that one, like, core thing that explains everything.
Exactly. And Villanova argues that this intense focus on finding something measurable can really oversimplify how we view the mind. And he contrasts that with what he calls the European tradition, which is much more open to a bunch of different perspectives and really emphasizes things like empathy and, a deeper kind of understanding.
So instead of trying to find a single answer, the European model is more okay with, like, embracing the fact that it's complicated, even messy, right? That human experience is complex.
Exactly. And Villanova says this isn't just some abstract theoretical difference either. He argues that it's had a huge impact on the field of psychology as a whole.
I'm curious to hear more about that.
Well, he points to functionalism, which came out of the Anglo-American tradition.
Right, functionalism. I remember learning about that. It's all about the purpose of our thoughts and feelings, right? Like,
Yeah.
what function do they serve?
Exactly. It's all about the what of the mind. What do these mental processes actually do? How do they help us adapt? And what Villanova argues is that this very practical approach, this need to prove things experimentally, it just thrived in that Anglo-American context.
It really makes you think, like, what if the questions we're even asking about the mind are, like, already influenced by our background and our culture, you
That
know?
really does make you wonder.
Yeah.
And Villanova, he actually compares some psychological experiments to, get this, observing animals in a zoo.
Oh, wow. Okay, I see what you mean. So he's saying it's like we create these totally artificial environments, and then we expect them to somehow reflect how people actually act in the real world.
Precisely. And he suggests that this whole focus on super controlled experiments, it comes from that same Anglo-American drive to find this single center of the mind.
It's like trying to figure out how to drive by just focusing on one tiny part of the engine.
Right. And
Yeah.
ignoring everything else. Whereas that European model, with its emphasis on empathy and, a more nuanced understanding of experience, it might be more open to observing the messiness of human behavior in context.
So it's like we're talking about two completely different ways of even approaching what the mind is, right? Didn't Villanova mention something about Gordon Allport noticing this as well?
Yes. He brings up Gordon Allport, who is a big name in personality psychology, and Allport noticed the same kind of divide playing out.
Which makes sense. I mean, personality is all about those individual experiences.
Exactly. And Allport saw that it wasn't just like a difference in theories on paper. It showed up in the language psychologists used, the kind of research they valued, everything. It was like two separate camps.
So it's not about which model is the right one. It's really about how these assumptions shape the entire field.
And potentially even limit it.
Yeah.
And that's what Villanova's getting at. He's challenging us to really think about what questions we're asking, the methods we're using, and even whose voices and experiences are left out when one model kind of takes over the conversation.
I think there's something to be said for both of these models, though, right? It's like we've all had that experience where someone's giving you this totally logical explanation for something, but it just doesn't come close to how it actually feels, you know?
And that's exactly what Villanova wants us to think about. He's pushing us past this idea of just picking one or the other. Like maybe both models are onto something important, but it's the space in between, where they connect, that things get really interesting.
Instead of two totally separate maps, it's like we need a way to put them on top of each other to see where the lines match up, or maybe even where something totally new emerges.
Exactly. What if instead of trying to track down that single center of the mind, we considered the idea that maybe there are multiple centers of gravity, all these different forces that are constantly interacting?
So less about choosing a side and more about finding a way to hold both of these perspectives at the same time.
Right. And maybe the real challenge here is first recognizing how much our own background shapes how we understand what it even means to be human, and then using that awareness to approach all these different models with, a little more curiosity and openness.
It makes you wonder what we could learn if we could just find a way to bridge these two perspectives, right? This has been a fascinating conversation. Thanks for diving into all this with me today.